In the dusty heart of Clearwater's annual fair, where laughter mixed with the smell of roasted corn and fresh leather, a lone cowboy stood frozen as 30 pairs of eyes turned toward him. The crowd had formed a cruel circle around a young woman with vacant, unseeing eyes, their jeers echoing off the wooden stalls like gunshots in a canyon. Her white dress, meant for celebration, now bore the stains of thrown fruit and spilled cider. The cowboy's hand hovered near his holster, not for his gun, but trembling with a choice that could brand him an outcast forever. The woman's lips moved in silent prayer, tears carving clean paths down her dirt-stained cheeks, while the mob's laughter grew hungrier, more vicious. Then the cowboy stepped forward, his boots crunching on scattered apple cores and broken dreams. But what happened next would silence not just the crowd, but echo across the entire territory for generations to come. 3 days earlier, Jacob McKenna had ridden into Clearwater with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and the kind of loneliness that settles deep in a man's bones like winter cold. He'd been drifting from town to town for 2 years, ever since the war ended, and left him with memories that burned hotter than desert sand. The small room above Murphy's saloon had become his temporary refuge, 4 walls that knew his nightmares and asked no questions. Each morning he'd wake to the same routine, coffee black as his mood, a shave with hands that still shook sometimes, and long walks to the edge of town where the prairie stretched endless and forgiving. He worked odd jobs, fixing fences, shoeing horses, loading grain, anything that kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering back to battlefields where good men died for causes that felt hollow now. The townspeople knew him as polite but distant, a ghost of a man who paid his debts and minded his own business. The annual harvest fair had drawn families from 3 counties, their wagons kicking up dust clouds that painted the horizon orange. Jacob had planned to avoid the festivities, but the sound of fiddle music and children's laughter pulled at something buried deep in his chest. He found himself walking among the stalls, watching fathers hoist squealing children onto their shoulders and wives link arms with husbands who still looked at them like they hung the moon. That's when he saw her, Sarah Coleman, the preacher's daughter, sitting alone on a bench near the edge of the fairgrounds. Everyone in town knew her story. Born blind, lost her mother to fever when she was 12, now 22 and unmarked by any suitor's attention. She wore a simple white dress that her own careful stitches had made beautiful, her dark hair braided with wildflowers that someone, probably her father, had helped her pick. Her hands rested folded in her lap, and though she couldn't see the festivities, her face turned toward each burst of laughter like a flower following the sun. The trouble started when a group of young men, liquored up on stolen whiskey and drunk on their own cruelty, began to notice the preacher's blind daughter sitting alone. "Hey, boys," called out Tommy Brennan, the blacksmith's son who'd never outgrown his schoolyard meanness. "Looks like our little church mouse is all dressed up with nowhere to go." His companions, sons of merchants and farmers who'd should have known better, began to circle Sarah's bench like wolves scenting weakness. "Maybe she's waiting for a dancing partner," sneered another, loud enough for half the fire to hear. Sarah's posture stiffened, but she didn't move, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her flee. The crowd began to gather, some laughing nervously, others shaking their heads but doing nothing to intervene. Jacob felt his jaw clench as he watched respectability crumble in the face of entertainment. When Tommy Brennan grabbed Sarah's hand and yanked her to her feet, declaring he'd give her a real dance, Jacob's blood turned to ice. But his kindness was about to summon forces far more powerful than gratitude and far more dangerous than he could imagine. The mock dance became a spectacle of cruelty that would shame the devil himself. Tommy spun Sarah roughly, her white dress twirling as she stumbled blindly, her hands reaching out for something solid to hold. The crowd's laughter grew louder, feeding on itself like wildfire in dry grass. Someone threw an apple core that struck her shoulder, then another that splattered against her skirt. "Dance, little bird," they shouted, clapping their hands in rhythm to her humiliation. When Sarah finally stumbled and fell to her knees, her white dress now stained with mud and fruit juice, the laughter reached a crescendo that made Jacob's soul burn with rage. He'd learned in the war that there were two kinds of men, those who stood up when it mattered and those who found excuses to look away. The choice before him was simple and terrible: step forward and become the town pariah, or let an innocent woman suffer for the entertainment of cowards. He thought of his brother, who died believing that honor meant something, who'd whispered with his last breath that someone had to stand for the defenseless. Jacob stepped into the circle, his boots loud on the hard-packed earth, and the crowd's laughter began to falter as they recognized the look in his eyes. "The ladies had enough dancing for one evening," he said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from facing down death and finding it lacking. Tommy Brennan puffed up like a rooster, but something in Jacob's stillness made him step back. Jacob knelt beside Sarah, offering his hand with the gentle patience of a man accustomed to calming frightened horses. "Ma'am," he said softly, "might I escort you home?" Her unseeing eyes turned towards his voice, and for a moment the crowd's jeers faded into meaningless noise. She took his hand, small, calloused from sewing and washing, but steady, and let him help her to her feet. Jacob removed his jacket and draped it around her shoulders, the leather warm from his body and smelling of horse and honest work. As they began to walk through the hostile crowd, voices rose like angry bees, but Jacob ignored them all, focusing instead on matching his long stride to Sarah's careful steps. But word of Jacob's intervention spread faster than wildfire through dry grass, reaching the ears of men who viewed kindness as weakness and mercy as an insult to their own hardened hearts. Chief among these was Marcus Dalton, son of the town's wealthiest rancher, and a man who'd never been told no in his privileged life. Dalton had been among the crowd enjoying Sarah's humiliation, and he took Jacob's intervention as a personal affront to his entertainment. "That drifter thinks he's better than us," he told his companions, his words slurred by expensive whiskey and cheap pride. "Time someone taught him how things work in Clearwater." When Jacob walked back toward his room above the saloon, he found Marcus Dalton waiting for him with 5 of his father's ranch hands, their faces hard as winter ground and twice as unforgiving. "Well, well," Dalton drawled, his hand resting on his gun belt with practiced ease, "if it ain't the White Knight himself." The ranch hands spread out in a loose semicircle, cutting off Jacob's escape routes with the efficiency of men accustomed to herding cattle and troublesome drifters. But before Jacob could prepare for the fight that seemed inevitable, Sarah's voice cut through the night like a church bell calling souls to salvation. "Mr. McKenna?" She stood in her garden gate, still wearing his jacket over her stained dress. Her unseeing eyes turned unerringly toward the confrontation. "Is everything all right?" The presence of a witness, especially one who'd already suffered enough for one evening, changed the dynamic completely. Dalton's men shifted uncomfortably, their courage diminishing in the face of a woman who'd done nothing wrong except exist while vulnerable. Sarah stepped into the street with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every crack in the sidewalk, every loose board in the fence, every safe step between her door and the wider world. "I do hope it stays friendly," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from surviving 22 years of darkness without losing faith in the light. "My father always says that violence is just fear wearing a mask." Dalton's face flushed red, but even he couldn't draw on an unarmed man in front of a preacher's daughter without losing what little honor he had left. The next morning brought news that would shake Clearwater to its foundations. Sarah Coleman was not just the preacher's blind daughter, she was also the sole heir to a silver mine that her grandfather had discovered in the mountains 30 years ago. The old man had kept the location secret, sharing it only with his son-in-law, who'd passed the knowledge to his daughter along with a detailed map written in a code that only she could read, raised dots and dashes pressed into leather that her fingers could interpret like music. The mine had been dormant for a decade, assumed played out, but a recent cave-in had revealed a new vein of ore that assayers valued at more than $50,000. Word of Sarah's unexpected wealth spread through town faster than gossip at a church social, and suddenly every bachelor within 50 miles was reconsidering the preacher's blind daughter with fresh interest. But the news also reached less honorable ears, including those of a gang led by a man called Black Pete Morrison, who'd been terrorizing mining camps from Colorado to New Mexico. Jacob found himself torn between the urge to ride out of town before trouble arrived and the growing certainty that Sarah would need protection in the coming days. He thought of his brother again, of the promises made to dying men about standing guard over the innocent, and knew that leaving now would be a betrayal of everything that made life worth living. When he found Sarah in the church garden the morning after the news broke, tending flowers with the same careful attention she'd always given them, she seemed remarkably calm about her changed circumstances. "People keep telling me how lucky I am," she said without preamble, her fingers gentle on a rose that would never show her its color. "But I can't help thinking that money has a way of making people see things that aren't really there." Jacob settled onto the bench beside her, close enough to catch the scent of lavender soap and morning air that seemed to follow her like a blessing. "What do you see?" he asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on a situation that had the whole town buzzing. "I see a woman who was invisible yesterday and too visible today," she said softly. "I see people who wouldn't spit on me if I was on fire, suddenly wanting to be my dearest friends." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not the casual clip-clop of a single rider, but the thunderous rumble of many horses moving fast and hard. Jacob's hand went instinctively to his gun as he stood, scanning the horizon for the source of the disturbance. What he saw made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. A dust cloud rising from the east road like a signal fire. Beneath it, a dark shapes of at least a dozen riders moving toward town with the purposeful speed of men who knew exactly what they wanted and how they planned to take it. "Sarah," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm her but needing her to understand the gravity of their situation, "I think it's time you visited your father in the chapel." Black Pete Morrison had come to Clearwater, and Jacob had the sinking feeling that his small act of kindness at the fair had drawn this evil straight to Sarah's door. Would you risk everything to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves? The riders pulled up in front of the saloon in a cloud of dust and jangling spurs, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces hidden beneath the brims of weather-beaten hats. Jacob counted 13 men, all armed, all watching the street with the casual alertness of predators surveying a hen house. Their leader dismounted with fluid grace despite his size. Morrison was a bear of a man with graying hair and eyes like winter sky, the kind of man who learned that fear was more effective than friendship and considerably more profitable. "Afternoon, citizens," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a snake oil salesman. "Beautiful day for a social call, don't you think?" No one answered. The street had emptied faster than water through a broken dam, leaving only Jacob standing in front of the church garden like a lone tree in a hurricane. Morrison's smile widened as he spotted Jacob, recognizing him as the only obstacle between his gang and their prize. "You must be the famous McKenna I've been hearing about," he said conversationally, approaching with his hands visible but ready, "the knight in shining armor who rescued our little princess from her ball." Morrison's proposition was as simple as it was evil. Jacob would convince Sarah to sign over the mining rights to Morrison's business associates in exchange for her continued good health and his own safe passage out of town. "You see," Morrison explained with the patience of a teacher instructing a slow student, "a blind woman has no business owning property of such magnitude. Why, anything could happen to her. Accidents, falls, mysterious fires that start in the middle of the night. Terrible tragedies, really, but so preventable with the right kind of protection." His men chuckled at this transparent threat, their laughter holding the same cruel edge that had marked the crowd at the fair, but amplified by the casual brutality of professional violence. Jacob felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler, but forced himself to remain calm and assess his options. Sarah's life hung in the balance, and one wrong word could start a gunfight that would end with both of them dead and Morrison riding away with everything. But before Morrison could elaborate on his threats, a new voice cut through the tense morning air like a blade through silk. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah called from the church steps, her white dress bright as hope against the dark wood. "I believe you wanted to speak with me." She moved with the careful confidence of someone navigating familiar ground, one hand trailing along the railing while the other held something small and metallic that caught the sunlight. Morrison's eyebrows rose in surprise. He'd clearly expected to negotiate with Jacob rather than face his intended victim directly. But his smile returned quickly, broader and more predatory than before. "Miss Coleman," he replied with exaggerated courtesy, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of respect. "How delightful to meet you at last. I trust you understand why we've come calling." What Sarah held in her hand was a small silver locket, unremarkable to most eyes, but clearly significant to her. She opened it with practiced ease, revealing not a miniature portrait, but a complex pattern of raised dots that her fingers read like a favorite book. "This belonged to my grandfather," she said, her voice carrying across the silent street with the clarity of church bells. "And it contains the only accurate map to the mine you're so interested in. He encoded it in a language only I can read, pressed into the metal with tools he made himself." Morrison's eyes fixed on the locket with unmistakable hunger, but Sarah continued before he could speak. "The thing is, Mr. Morrison, grandfather wasn't just a miner. He was also a demolitions expert who learned his trade blowing up Confederate supply lines during the war. Before he died, he rigged the mine with enough black powder to bring down half the mountain." She smiled then, an expression both serene and terrifying in its implications. "The map doesn't just show where the silver is, it shows which supports to avoid if you don't want to be buried alive." Morrison's confidence wavered for the first time as he realized that his simple plan had suddenly become much more complicated than anticipated. But before Morrison could call Sarah's bluff, the morning air filled with a new sound, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats from the west road, accompanied by the glint of sunlight on metal and the distinctive rhythm of cavalry on the march. Jacob's heart leapt as he recognized the blue uniforms and get-on of a Union Army patrol, 20 soldiers led by a young lieutenant who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but in the middle of a territorial dispute. "Lieutenant Hayes," Sarah called out as the patrol approached, her voice carrying the warmth of someone greeting an old friend. "How nice to see you again. I trust your mother is feeling better." The young officer's face brightened as he recognized her, and Jacob began to understand that Sarah Coleman had been playing a much deeper game than anyone realized. She hadn't been helplessly waiting for rescue. She'd been maneuvering pieces on a chessboard that none of them could fully see. Lieutenant Hayes dismounted with military precision, his hand resting on his saber hilt as he assessed the situation with the quick efficiency of a man trained to read potential battlefields. "Miss Coleman," he replied warmly, "Mother's doing much better, thanks to those herbs you prepared for her fever." His tone cooled considerably as he turned toward Morrison and his gang, professional authority replacing personal warmth. "Gentlemen, I'm Lieutenant Hayes, United States Army. Might I ask what brings so many armed men to our peaceful little town?" The lieutenant's next words revealed the true scope of Sarah's planning and Jacob's growing amazement at her strategic thinking. "Miss Coleman," Hayes said formally, "I have a letter here from the territorial governor regarding your recent inheritance and the need for federal protection of mining claims in this region." He produced an official-looking document from his saddlebags, the paper heavy with seals and signatures that carried the weight of distant authority. But Morrison hadn't survived years of outlawry by surrendering at the first sign of official resistance. His hand dropped toward his gun as desperation overcome caution, the realization that this might be his last chance to salvage something from the situation overriding his survival instincts. "Federal protection don't mean much out here, boy," he snarled at Hayes, his mask of civility finally slipping to reveal the killer underneath. "And dead governors can't enforce dead laws." Several of his men began to follow his lead, hands moving toward weapons as the morning air crackled with impending violence. But before anyone could draw, Sarah stepped forward into the space between the two groups, her unseeing eyes somehow managing to look directly at Morrison with an expression of profound sadness. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silent street like a funeral prayer. "I'm truly sorry for whatever happened to you that made you think this was the only way to live. But I won't let you destroy this town the way someone destroyed your soul." In that moment of perfect stillness, Sarah opened her locket one final time and let its contents spill into her palm. Not a map, as she'd claimed, but a small glass vial filled with silver dust that caught the morning sunlight like captured starfire. "This is all that's left of Grandfather's mine," she announced calmly, letting the precious metal trickle through her fingers to sparkle in the dust at her feet. "He played it out 20 years ago and died keeping the secret to save his family from men exactly like you." The profound silence that followed her revelation was broken only by Morrison's strangled curse and the soft whisper of wind carrying silver dust into the morning air. Jacob stared at her in amazement, understanding finally that everything, the inheritance story, the encoded map, the federal protection, had been an elaborate performance designed to bring Morrison and his gang into the open where they could be dealt with legally rather than allowing them to strike from the shadows. The aftermath unfolded with the swift efficiency of military justice in a territory where such justice was often the only kind available. Morrison and his gang found themselves facing charges that ranged from conspiracy to attempted robbery to threatening federal interests, each count carrying penalties that would keep them behind bars until their beards turned gray. Lieutenant Hayes explained to Jacob that Sarah's inheritance had actually been a carefully orchestrated trap designed by territorial authorities to draw out the outlaw gangs that had been terrorizing mining communities throughout the region. "Miss Coleman volunteered to play the role of helpless victim," Hayes said with obvious admiration, knowing full well that it would paint a target on her back. "Took more courage than most soldiers I know have got." Jacob found himself looking at Sarah with new eyes, understanding that the quiet woman he'd thought he was protecting had actually been protecting everyone else, using herself as bait to eliminate a threat that had claimed dozens of innocent lives. As the outlaws were led away in chains, Jacob approached Sarah with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment that left him struggling for words. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally, thinking of all the worry and fear he'd carried over the past few days. Sarah turned toward him with that gentle smile that had first caught his attention, her unseeing eyes somehow managing to look directly into his soul. "Because," she said simply, "I needed someone to care about me without knowing why they should. I needed someone to stand up for me when it didn't benefit them in any way. I needed to know that kindness still existed in this world, not because of what I could give in return, but just because it was right." Her words hit him like a revelation, making him understand that his simple act of decency at the fair had been the cornerstone of a much larger plan, not just to catch Morrison, but to prove to herself that goodness still existed in a world that seemed increasingly dark and cynical. 6 months later, Jacob McKenna stood in the same church garden where he'd first truly seen Sarah Coleman, but now he wore a marshal's badge and she wore a ring that caught the morning sunlight like a promise kept. Their wedding had been the social event of the season, attended by territorial officials and half the citizens of 3 counties who'd come to witness the union of the blind woman who'd brought down Black Pete Morrison and the drifter who'd risked everything for simple human decency. Sarah's real inheritance had turned out to be her grandfather's ranch in the foothills, a spread of good grazing land that she and Jacob would work together, building something that would last beyond their own lifetimes. As Jacob watched Sarah move through their new home with the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was, he marveled at the chain of events that had brought them together. A moment of cruelty at a county fair had become the catalyst for justice, love, and redemption on a scale neither of them could have imagined. The laughter that had once tormented an innocent woman had been silenced not by violence, but by the revelation that true strength lay in protecting the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. Morrison and his gang would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, but more importantly, their reign of terror had ended because one woman had been brave enough to make herself a target, and one man had been decent enough to stand beside her when it mattered most. Years later, as Jacob sat on their porch watching Sarah teach their young daughter to tend the garden by touch and smell, he often reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought them together. The child would grow up knowing that her mother was a hero who'd risked everything to protect others, and that her father had chosen love over safety when it mattered most. She would learn that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to do what was right despite being afraid, and that the smallest acts of kindness could change the world in ways that no one could predict. The greatest threats to any community are not the outlaws who ride in with guns blazing, but the cruelty we allow to flourish in our own hearts. Every act of kindness strengthens the bonds that hold society together, while every act of cruelty weakens them until we become vulnerable to those who would destroy everything we've built. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply stand up for someone who can't stand up for themselves, even when the whole world is laughing and telling you to sit down. Would you have risked everything to defend a stranger's dignity when it would have been so much easier to look away? Subscribe for more powerful stories of courage and redemption that prove love conquers all, and click on the video on the screen to watch our next tale with a twist so unexpected you'll never see it coming.